Good afternoon, and once again, welcome. This lesson is being recorded for Sunday, June the 21st, 2026. This is the lesson that will be presented when we gather together here in Bellflower at the Rose Avenue Church of Christ at 6 o'clock in the evening. And as is always the case, if you are in our area, we do invite you to come and be with us as we gather together throughout the week, both to study God's Word and to worship Him. We meet every Sunday morning at 9:45 for a Bible study. At 10:50, our morning worship service. At 6 o'clock, our evening worship service. And on Wednesday night at 7:30, we have another Bible study. And you're welcome every time that we gather together for these particular purposes here. As a matter of fact, if you are in our area, we would be honored by your presence. We are a small group of God's people striving to do what is right in His sight. And it's always an encouragement when others of like precious faith or those striving to do that which is right meet with us as we are worshiping and studying from God's Word. So please come be with us if you are in our area. In the meantime, we will continue to share the messages that are presented because we're not trying to hide anything. We will share these messages with you in these formats here on both YouTube as well as on Facebook. As I mentioned in my previous lesson, I have not been here for 2 weeks. I've actually been on vacation the past 2 Sundays and so on, but it is good to be back. However, having said that, at this time I am dealing with some health issues. I have a cold, which you probably can hear in my voice, and I have some other issues going on. And so just bear with me as we go through this lesson. If you hear coughing, I actually have some water that I might take from time to time. But anyways, that's irrelevant. Let's just get started with the lesson that we have prepared here. Of course, typically on the second Sunday night of the month, we have been engaged in a journey through the Bible now for about 4.5 years. And we are continuing in the seventh time period, which is the United Kingdom. And our lesson today is 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. Now, as I said, typically we present this on the second Sunday, but of course I wasn't here last week. So I'm presenting this as the lesson this particular week. We are dealing with the United Kingdom at this time, which, as I pointed out, is the ninth of the 17 different time periods of Bible history that we have been looking at. And this is the period that is known as the United Kingdom. It is a period where Israel was governed by a king. And we know during this time period, it lasted about 120 years under three kings, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. From approximately 1050 to 930 BC. And of course, in our last lesson, we dealt with the tragic ending of the first of these kings, and that is King Saul. And what we noted in that lesson is how he and his sons perished in a battle against the Philistines. The Philistines were victorious. And of course, we find that after Saul falls on his sword and kills himself, having been mortally wounded. It wasn't just an outright suicide and so on, but we find it taking place. He did not want to be mistreated by his captives. So he dies. And of course, the Philistines come across his body. They cut off his head. They cut off his hands and feet, and those of Jonathan and other sons who perished. And they basically mutilated the body. Of course, we also talked about how the men of Jabesh Gilead heard about this, and they went and they traveled and they retrieved their bodies and basically brought them back, and they burned them in a respectful way. And then, of course, they buried the remains respectfully. And that brings us to our lesson where we want to begin today. And this is another chapter, if you will, of this period of the United Kingdom. We are going to be dealing with the reign of David. He's anointed king. And we're going to be dealing with the first 4 chapters and touch on chapter 5 in 2 Samuel. So we're going to the second book dealing with this period. David has returned from fighting the Amalekites. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse number 1. And as he does it, he's waiting for word about Saul and the battle that he had with the Philistines. And we find that there's a servant who is identified as an Amalekite, which is interesting because David has been fighting against the Amalekites. But here was one somewhat loyal to Israel. You know, he comes and he reports that Saul and Jonathan had both been killed. And David asks, "How do you know that?" And he basically says, "I came across them." And he makes the point that Saul had been mortally wounded and Saul wanted me to finish him off. And he said, "And so I did. And I took his crown and I took his bracelet and I'm bringing them to you as the king." And so, more than likely, he was with the way that he reported it rather than being truthful, because we know in our last lesson that's not how it happened. Yes, Saul was mortally wounded and he was dying and he was going to die, but we find that he asks his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer refuses, knowing who the king is. Saul ends up falling on his own sword, and then the armor bearer falls on his own sword. They both die. So this Amalekite, at best, witnessed what happened there. At worst, he just comes across their bodies, and he's one of the first ones. And of course, he collects the crown and the bracelet, and he brings them to David, probably hoping to be rewarded as a result of this. But of course, that's not what happens, because David is upset when he hears of this individual and what he has done. He says, "Why were you not fearful to put to death the Lord's anointed one?" And he orders that this servant himself be executed. And in the last and in and in the last part of that particular section, he basically says, "Your blood is on your own head," is what you read in verse number 16. "For your mouth said, I have killed the Lord's anointed." And so he's executed on this particular occasion because of this report. Well, continuing in the text, we find in verses 17 to 27 that David is mourning the death of Saul and Jonathan. And he writes a psalm which is sometimes described as the Song of the Bow. And it's a song, we're told in verse number 18 of 2 Samuel 1, that it was to be taught to the children of Judah and so on. And it was written in the book of Jasher, or whatever is involved in that particular book. And beginning in verse 19, "The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen." So here he's mourning the death of Saul and Jonathan. And it's important to understand that, considering the relationship that he had with Saul. You still see respect in this. In verse 20, "Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph." So he's basically saying in there, don't extend their rejoicing. Don't rejoice along with them in the death of Saul as king and so on. This is a time of mourning as this particularly takes place here. And so he goes on, and interesting. It's interesting to note that what David is emphasizing here, he's emphasizing the fact that Israel has been defeated. Yes, he's mourning the death of Saul and Jonathan, but also this is a setback for Israel, if you will. And that's one of the concerns that he has. But he goes on, and in verse 21, "O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with all oil." And it's interesting to observe, he metaphorically calls upon nature to actually mourn where Saul and Jonathan actually perished. And so that's that. Like I said, that's just metaphorical, talking about the sadness of the occasion and so on. And he goes on and he describes them as mighty. Verse number 22, "From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty." In other words, he touts their successes as he says that. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives. Verse 23, "And in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. They died together valiantly," is basically the point that he describes that. In verse 24, "O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel." And so he's calling for them again. Just this is a time of mourning that these have happened. Verse 25, "How the mighty have fallen, in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. And as I've emphasized every time I've read that, without apology, especially think about that in the month that we're in, this is platonic. That's all that he is describing here, is a very, very close friend. And he concludes how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. And so here we find this psalm of memorial, remembering Saul and Jonathan in their deaths. Now that brings us to chapter 2, and what happens here is following this. It says that after this, David inquired of the Lord, chapter 2 and verse 1, saying, "Shall I go to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go up." David said, "Where shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So here we have David. He inquires, "What do I do next? Do I return to Judah? Saul is finally dead. Can I go home?" And the Lord says, "Yes." And he says, "Where should I go?" And he says, "Go to Hebron." And then we read in the next few verses there, he takes his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelite, and Abigail, and he takes the men who were with him, who have been faithful to him all this time, and they return to Judah. And then you read in an important verse here in verse 4 of chapter 2, it says, "Then the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul." So as a result of this, David sends word to the men of Jabesh Gilead, basically praising them and thanking them for their act of kindness where Saul was concerned. And he basically says, "It will not go unnoticed. I'm king. I am now king, and I will not let this go unnoticed, the good deed that you have done." Then, in beginning in verse 8 of this chapter, we read that Abner, and this is still somewhat of an act of rebellion here. He basically takes Ishbosheth, one of the sons of Saul, he brings him to Mahanaim, and he makes him king over Gilead, and basically pronounces that he would be king basically over all of Israel with the exception of Judah. And we read concerning Ishbosheth that he's 40 years old, and he is going to reign for 2 years. Now, one of the things that is interesting to observe, if you have a map, is Mahanaim is actually east of the Jordan River. And that's kind of an interesting observation. In other words, Abner's making him king, but he's not even king in Israel proper. Where he is made a king is over on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which is an indication of the weakness of his kingdom. And that's a point to consider as you think about that, because we're just going to read about Ishbosheth in these chapters that we're dealing with, and he's not a very powerful king. He's weak, and as a matter of fact, he's not even the power behind the throne. What you learn as you go through this text is Abner is actually the power behind the throne. He's the one that is propping up Ishbosheth. You might even say that Ishbosheth is nothing more than a puppet, because Abner does what Abner wants to do. And you see that throughout the text. But interestingly, following Abner making Ishbosheth king, you read in chapter 2, verses 12 through the end of this chapter, you read here that Joab, who is the commander of David's army, and Abner, the commander of Saul and Ishbosheth's army, they meet near Gibeon, and basically they stage what I would describe as a contest. They say, "Let our young men fight each other. You choose 12 men, we will choose 12 men, and we'll see who is stronger." And basically the way that it is described is these 24 men went against each other. They fought each other. They grabbed each other by their beards and stabbed each other. And it seems to indicate that all 24 of them killed each other and they all died. So basically what you have is a draw on this occasion. But this leads to the war, or this battle taking place. And basically Judah and Israel engage in battle on this particular occasion. And what we read here is Judah is more powerful than all of Israel, and they overpower Israel to the point that they begin to flee. And as they are fleeing, so is Abner, and Abner is in his chariot at this particular time being pursued by Joab and the army. And we find that one of Joab's brothers, and if I read this correctly in my notes, actually Joab would have been a nephew to David himself. So there is some blood relationship from that standpoint. And he has two brothers. One is named Asahel and the other one Ahinoam. And we find that Asahel, who is a fast runner, he's pursuing Abner in his chariot. And Abner looks behind him and sees him and verifies that it is Asahel. And he basically says, "Stop following me." He says, "I don't want to do anything to you to upset Joab." So he's not picking the fight here, and he tells him, "Turn back, leave me. Get armor from one of the soldiers who are to the side of the road and so on." But he refuses. He keeps following after him. He warns him a second time, "Back off." And he doesn't do it. So Abner takes the blunt end of his spear and he jabs it into his stomach. And it actually goes all the way through. And Asahel actually stops there and he ends up dying right there. Now, I want you to bear in mind, I don't know that Abner intended to kill him on this occasion. The idea of he's hit him with the blunt end could imply that all he wanted to do was knock the wind out of him so he would leave him alone. But nevertheless, he is killed at this occasion. And of course, the army, along with Joab, they come to where Asahel is and they see him there and they stop because of what has happened. Nevertheless, we read that Joab continues to pursue after Abner shortly after this, along with Abishai, his brother. And basically, when they reach the army of Abner where it is at, Abner actually calls out, and what I would describe as a truce, and it may even be, as some would describe it, as he's actually saying, "I surrender. Well, I surrender to you on this particular occasion. Why do you continue to pursue your brethren?" And of course, Joab listens to that, realizing that they are brethren, and he says, and long story short, both armies go their separate ways, and they return to their respective lands and so on at that particular occasion. So for the time being, the battle is stayed a little bit. But we do read in chapter 3 that war continues in verse number 1, chapter 3, and in verse number 1, it says, "There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker." So they continue to fight each other now for a few years, and that is the way that it is described. Now, next we come to chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, where we find David's family. And it's interesting, you read here that David actually has 6 wives and 6 sons. You know, we knew about 2 of them, Ahinoam and Abigail, and we find that he has a son by each one of them, but he also has 4 other wives that are described here. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abitai. And the sixth, Ithream, by David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. So during a period of 7 years, he has 6 sons and he has 6 wives. Now, I want you to understand most of these wives were most likely alliances. One of the things that kings did as they made covenants with their neighboring nations is they would give one of their children as a spouse to the king of that other nation. And basically that made them blood is what it did. And so it kind of tightened up the covenant a little bit, was the intent. And then of course when a child was born, that child was mixed blood of the 2 different nations and so on. So you find, and I say that's true of at least 4 of these wives. that you have taken place here, and that's why he has so many wives, and that'll explain the 700 wives of Solomon much later on when we eventually get to that, probably sometime next year. But we find here in chapter 3, verses 6 through 16, that following this, the next thing that happens is Abner is accused by Ishbosheth of going into one of Saul's concubines, and her name was Rizpah. Now, what's interesting when you read the text and the way that Abner responds, at first glance, you might think that he was insulted because he was accused of something that he had not done. But actually, when you read closer, we don't know whether or not Ahab had actually gone into her. It's possible that he had. The one thing that we learn about Abner throughout all this text is he's the one that is running things in Israel. As I said, Ishbosheth, yes, he's the king, but he's king in name. He's somewhat of a puppet to whatever Abner wants to do. And you find that in this text because after he is accused and after Abner becomes angry in verse number 8, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Basically, he makes the point here that I'm gonna see to it that the kingdom is turned over to Judah, to David. I'm going to make David. I'm going to make David king of everybody, as he says in verse 9. May God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him. And I want to make an observation about that right there, and that is the fact that as Abner says this, Abner knew the will of God. Abner knew that it was God's intent that David was going to be king. Yet he continues to try and, for lack of a better term, establish the house of Saul after Saul is dead. And that's why he puts this weak king into power and makes him king over what he described as Israel. But again, he's not even reigning on the west of the Jordan River and so on. So that's the situation you're dealing with. But as a result of the challenge that takes place here, Abner begins what I describe as the process of unification. And he does it by sending a delegation to David, requesting that they work together. And he offers to unite them together. He wants to make a covenant with them. And this is an interesting thing. In chapter 3 and in verse number 13, David agrees. But we read in verse 13, David said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you. You shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. So understand what's happening here is David says, yeah, I'll make a covenant with you, but first you have to give me my wife. And of course, we've talked about this a little bit in previous lessons with Saul. After David has fled from Saul, and you may remember the account with Michal. She loves David, and she helps David escape. But then she also lies to Saul. And in the midst of Saul pursuing David, even after the first time that David had spared Saul and the incident that you read about with Nabal, you read in 1 Samuel 25:44 that Saul gave Michal to another man, Palti was his name, as wife. So Saul thought that he would nullify the covenant of God. But what I want you to notice here is it didn't nullify that covenant. Marriage is for life. And I think you see a little bit of an illustration of that here. I know there's complications attached to that, but Michal was David's wife. Even if she was now with Palti, and whether or not she wanted to leave him, we know that Ishbosheth sins and takes Michal from Paltiel, and he's crying and pleading for her to come back. He probably loves her. Very likely he loves her and he doesn't want to lose her. But Abner is very strong and says to him, "Go away." And he does. So, and the point that I want to emphasize here is I just wonder, did God recognize the marriage of Michael and Paltiel? Based on this text, no, he did not. So we find Michael is returned to David. And of course, that leads to the covenant. And interesting, and I want to read these verses 17 through 21 of 2 Samuel chapter 3, because this is how Abner is talking to the people of Israel. And he says he communicated with the elders of Israel, saying, "In times past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and the hand of their enemies." And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Then Abner said to David, "I will arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires." David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So Abner is acknowledging, he makes the case. You wanted David as your king, and now you have opportunity. And he also makes the case that this is what God had intended all along. This is what Yahweh, your God, had intended. So it's interesting, and again, I can't help but ask when I think about this is when Abner made uh, 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 Ishbosheth, when Abner made Ishbosheth king, was he being rebellious against Yahweh on that particular occasion there? He knew what the intent was. He was with Saul when the declarations were made. He knew that David was supposed to be king. I think Saul even acknowledged it later on. But yet Abner continued to act in defiance against that will. Well, continuing in our text, we find that Abner has been sent away and his plan is to unite the nation. Joab returns from basically fighting for David where he was. I'm not sure, but it says that he was raiding and basically pillaging the villages, brought back much spoil. So he was continuing to defend Judah and the nation and so on. But he hears that David has made a covenant with Ahab, and he's angry about it. Matter of fact, he says the only reason Ahab came to you is he wanted to spy you out. He's not really interested in being loyal to you, but you got to bear in mind that Joab is bitter because of what Ahab did to his brother. So after this takes place, we find that Joab sends for Abner to return because he wants to talk to him. And of course, Abner does return, and then Joab takes him to a private place, and it says that he stabbed him and he died on that particular occasion. And one of the things that is emphasized in all of this is he did not do it for the security of Judah. This was not an act associated with war. This was murder. This was taking vengeance on the fact that Abner had killed his brother. And more than likely, as I point out, perhaps Abner really did not intend to kill him. He just wanted to stop him from pursuing after him. And that's what I read into it by the blunt end of his spear. Maybe there's more to it than that. I don't know. But we read that Joab and his other brother Abishai, that they conspired against Ahab, and as a result of that, Ahab dies on this occasion. Now, David hears about this, and David is not happy about it. As a matter of fact, you read in verses 28 through 30, he said, "My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or a leper, who leans on a staff, or falls by a sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai his brother killed Abner because he had killed his brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. So here you have this taking place here. And David basically says, I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with this. And to further prove that, as you continue in the text, you find in verses 30 through 39 that David mourns the death of Abner. And it's interesting, in verse 31 it says, he makes Joab and his men tear their clothes and wear sackcloth, mourning the death of Abner. So you have a little bit of a reverse of that takes place. And furthermore, he gives Abner an honorable burial on this particular occasion. He laments over Abner. He fasts for the day. And the people are observing this. And when I say the people, more than likely those who were allies with Abner, who had come for the sake of this covenant. We don't know exactly who it was, but the people, they basically see that David was genuine about it, because they try to get David to eat food, and David says, no, I'm not going to eat food till sunset. I'm fasting as I mourn for the death of Abner. And he calls Abner a good man from that standpoint. But then you read in verse number 39 of the text, it says, after this, and I am weak today. This is David speaking. Verse 38, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king. And these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. The Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. And I want you to note that what he says there is, I'm going to leave this in the hands of God. And that's what he does. Now that brings us to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, what we find here is that Ishbosheth hears about Abner's death, and he's fearful. He loses heart. Again, remember, I see him described as a weak king. We are also in this text introduced to Mephibosheth, who we will get to him in a future lesson. Mephibosheth was a son of Jonathan, and it says he's described as being lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when Jonathan was killed, and the maidservant was fleeing as these events were taking place, and she falls down and basically injures Mephibosheth so that he was crippled from that day forward. And he's just mentioned in verse 4, and we'll get back to him in another lesson. But we also find that there are two captains in the army of Ishbosheth, Baana and Rechab. And so basically what they do is, in the heat of the day, while Ishbosheth is resting, they conspire against him, and they go in and they kill him. They cut off his head, and they basically bring it to David. And so here the king of Israel is dead. And again, you have another, I think it's an idea similar to the Amalekite that came to David and said he was the one that finished off Saul. They think they're going to be rewarded as a result of this. We've removed your enemy. But instead, David is upset and basically saying, you killed an innocent man. You killed a righteous man. And David has them executed. He makes the point, he said, if you knew what I did to the Amalekite who reported that he had killed Saul, and probably by this time he knows that he wasn't the one that killed Saul. But the bottom line is, he said, you know what I did to him? I'm going to do the same thing to you. And he basically says, you're more guilty. You have no excuse whatsoever. And so he has them executed. And he calls Mephibosheth a righteous individual. Now that brings me to the conclusion of my text. And I want to finish this with 2 Samuel chapter 5 and read the first 5 verses. I'm just going to read over this, a couple of comments, and then we'll start making some applications. And incidentally, here we come to 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, which is somewhat of a parallel passage to 2 Samuel chapter 5. Now let me tell you, everything that I've talked about in this lesson today, up to this point, is not recorded in the Chronicles. This is. And what we read here, it says in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. Also, in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. Therefore, all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron and King David and made a covenant with him at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So here we find this is where things start to change. They acknowledge that David being king is the will of God, and they acknowledge him as their king. Israel anoints David just as Judah had done previously. They make a covenant with him, and then the text records that David's 30 years old when he becomes king, and he's going to reign for some 40 years. 7.5 years in Hebron over Judah, 33 years in Jerusalem over all of Israel. And we'll touch on Judah next time. But here's my concluding thought about the text that we've been dealing with. Finally, the kingdom of Israel is united. And they are united under one king on this particular occasion. So there you have the context. Now, as we've done with all of these lessons, let's make some applications and let's look at some lessons that we can learn based on the text that we have dealt with today. And the first one that I want to mention is to deal with the concept of mourning over death. You know, David's character is revealed by his reaction to the death of his enemy, of Saul, as well as his friend Jonathan. You know, he's not sitting there rejoicing because his enemy is finally dead. The same thing with Ishbosheth when he dies. You know, he doesn't do that. The one thing that we need to understand is when somebody dies, even if it is an enemy, or you might say, especially if it is an enemy, our enemy, or even worse than that, an enemy of God, never forget that this person is dying and his soul is going to go somewhere and spend eternity. And very likely, if he's not saved, he's going to spend eternity in hell. He's going to spend eternity lost. Hebrews 9:27, and as it has been appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. You know, it's so sad sometimes on the news when somebody dies, you hear about people rejoicing over the death of some individual that was murdered or assassinated or dies for one reason. Because this is my enemy. This is the one that I hate so much because he disagrees with me politically, because he disagrees with my moral views, and now he's dead, and then there's celebration over those types of things. That ought to bother you. And I'm going to tell you right now, as a Christian, that's not the way you ought to act. We ought to never rejoice over the death of someone, especially the death of the wicked. It may mean that peace is going to come your way, possibly, not always. I mean, look at everything that happened even after Saul was dead. But understand that there's a soul that's going to spend eternity somewhere. Another lesson that I learned from this is David has respect for authority, and we've emphasized this throughout his interactions with Saul. He's the Lord's anointed. Even though Saul had made himself into David's enemy, David always respected him as king. And we are reminded in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, that we are to submit to the governing authorities. Paul said that. Peter said it in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. You honor the king. You submit to both governors as well as their ordinances, the laws that they make. And of course, we know that there's the one exception and so on. But the point is we have to submit to our governing authorities, even the ones that are wicked. even the ones that stand contrary to God's will as far as their behavior. We have to obey their laws and we need to honor them. Now, we don't honor the things that they are doing that are lawless, but the fact that they are there, we honor the office. And that's the bottom line. Another lesson that we can learn tied to this event with David learning about the death of Saul and Jonathan is deception has consequences. You have this Amalekite. David doesn't reward him because he finished off Saul. He says, you've killed God's anointed. And the point that we learn from that is you know what? God does not want us to be deceitful people. And I think I talked about this in our last lesson. God wants us to be honorable and God wants us to be honest in our dealings with one another. We need to put away lying. We need to speak truth where our neighbor is concerned. And God knows not only whether you're being deceitful or not, He knows the motives behind what you are saying and why that has taken place. Another lesson that we learn from this text is that God keeps His word. You know, how many years prior to this was it when David was anointed by Samuel as king? You're talking probably at least 10 years, maybe even more than that, since David was anointed. And yet just now it's coming to fruition. It has finally been accomplished. And this just demonstrates, and incidentally, this is the big picture behind going through these 17 periods of Bible history. You learn that God's in control, and you learn that God keeps His word. He makes promises, and He's going to keep His promises. So when we read in the New Testament promises that God has made to us, we need to know that He can keep those promises. And along that lines, another lesson I learned from this is you do all in the name of the Lord. And again, even though David has learned that Saul is now dead, before David makes another move in chapter 2 and in verse number 1, he inquires of the Lord, should I return to Judah now? And if so, when God says, yes, return to Judah, he says, okay, where do I need to go? And he says, go to Hebron. And David does what the Lord tells him to do. Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. We need to submit to the will of God in everything that we do. Another lesson that we can learn from this is about time. And this goes back to God is going to accomplish His purpose. And the thing we need to understand is while it likely took more than a decade from the time that God anointed David, we find He did accomplish His plan. And sometimes plans don't happen or unfold overnight. Matter of fact, sometimes the more meaningful plans are plans that take time. You're not going to become a mature Christian overnight. It's going to take time for you to develop. If you're dealing with struggles in your life, your chances are you're not going to overcome that struggle in a single moment or in a day. It takes time to overcome those types of things. That's something that addicts who are trying to overcome whatever their addiction is, that's what they learn. It takes time to conquer whatever it is that you are dealing with. But what we're reminded of here is God, He works in His time. His time frame is not our time frame. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us with the Lord a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. And understand that we may not ever understand God's timing, but He is in control. And that's the point we must not forget. So we see when David is finally made king, God's accomplished His purpose. It took time, but it happened. So if things don't unfold immediately in your life, kind of a little bit of what we talked about in our previous lesson today, dealing with discouragement, don't give up. Another lesson is that unity takes work. I think there's an interesting observation where you find in chapter 3, Abner, he's working to bring Israel and Judah together. And it's not something, again, that's going to be easy to accomplish. It takes some effort to do that. We're commanded to be united. Over in Ephesians chapter 4, you read in verses 1 through 3 that we are to pursue unity. You read there in that text, it says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We work at it. Psalm 133 and verse 1 says, Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Unity, as much as we would like for it to be instant, it's not. It takes work. Abner, even though it's a little later in the game than it should have been, he's working to bring Israel and Judah together. And it happens. God wants us to be united and to work at it. Another powerful lesson we see here, that again we see this over and over, another trait of David is the power of forgiveness. And what I think of in this is when Abner comes to him offering to make a covenant, David's willing to forgive Abner and Ishbosheth. And he even shows great kindness to them in the efforts that take place. And I'm going to tell you right now, in our lives, forgiveness is something that we need to consider at all times. Colossians 3 and verse 13. We bear with one another and forgive one another if anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you must also do. Matthew 6, 14 and 15, elaborating on the model prayer. If you forgive men their trespasses, God will forgive you your trespasses. If you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive yours. You want God to forgive you, you better be willing to forgive others. We see in the example of David, one who has been mistreated all this time, and yet he's willing to forgive. Remember, Abner was the general of Saul. David forgives him. Ishbosheth, his son, he forgives him, declares him as righteous. Another lesson we learned is the influence of strong leadership. You know, you look at the example of David, and you're going to see this even more as we continue. We've already seen it in the conduct of David, but his character and his actions demonstrate why he is an effective leader. He's a servant leader that cares about the people. And you know, I can't help but think that God, in his wisdom, Ephesians 3, verses 10 and 11, in his eternal wisdom, he's given us the church. And he's given us a pattern, 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, and other passages. He's given us a pattern for strong leadership in the church. Leadership that will keep the church pure. Leadership that will make the church what God intends for her to be. And I think we look to David, we see the power of strong leadership. And finally, we see a call for justice and mercy. David dealt swiftly with unjust and wicked behavior. He executed the assassins of Ishbosheth. And he took note of Joab and the wickedness that he had done, and he laid it in God's hands. He did not excuse it. He did not ignore it. As a matter of fact, you'll find at the end of David's life, he gives Solomon instructions to deal with Joab because of his behavior. You know, I can't help but read in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse number 11, where Solomon wrote, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set on them to do evil. I believe one of the flaws of our society is we let too many people get away with too many things. We're too lenient with criminals. And it's not unusual for a criminal, because there is no teeth behind the consequences of their crimes, they keep doing it over and over and over. And typically what happens is it gets worse and worse and worse. The crimes get stronger and stronger. We need justice. We need mercy. Any society that is going to survive needs justice and mercy in it. And you find that in David, and you find that in Israel. So there you have another lesson in our study through the history of God's people as we journey through the Bible. You can see God is at work at every turn, which is our point. And even though what we have read about and studied today is written thousands of years ago, it's still meaningful to us today. And that's the point. Therefore, what does his word mean to you? What does God's word mean to you? Romans 15:4 says, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of scriptures might have hope. What does his word mean to you? Can you learn from what he would have you to do? So I encourage you to think about these things. And again, I thank you for listening to this lesson. And I hope you find benefit and some things that you can apply in your lives as you go through this week. And whatever time you are allotted, may God be with you in everything. And may you be with God in the decisions that you make. So thank you for listening. And until next week, have a good and faithful week. Goodbye.